This is a full story. Puppy wishes you all a happy and enjoyable story. The day I asked for a breakup, it was pouring rain. He stared at me for a long moment, stunned, then gave a bitter smile. Your grandma's gone, so I guess you don't need me anymore, right? He was right. I had been with him because of my grandmother's illness. I couldn't afford her surgery. Back then, Rocky had said, "Be with me, and I'll cover the expenses." Time seemed to freeze as the once endlessly gentle young man finally broke, his voice torn with pain. Hailey, did the 3 years I gave you mean nothing? 3 years later, he was now the renowned young CEO of the art group. I wore a large mask, hiding myself beneath the brim of a hat. As we passed each other, he glanced at me with a cold, distant smile and asked, "And you are?" Today, everyone at the station was frantically busy because a big figure was coming in for an exclusive interview. I'd only been an intern here for 2 months, so I wasn't familiar with everything. I turned to Alice, the senior staff member training me, and asked, "It's usually not this chaotic during interviews. Who is this important guest?" Alice, a veteran at the station, was in a flurry, directing everyone. "Hurry and get the script to the boss, the timing is tight, he needs to review it." After much hurrying, she finally had a moment to answer me. "It's definitely a big deal. Usually, our interviews are scheduled well in advance, and everything is set up beforehand. But this time, he approached us suddenly. The station had tried inviting him before, but he didn't accept. Somehow, he took the initiative this time, so everyone's rushing to make things perfect." "Oh, I see," I replied, holding up a background panel. "Where should I put this, Alice?" "Right behind the chair so it's in the shot." "Got it." Carefully maneuvering my 1.6-meter frame with the nearly 3-meter background, I positioned it behind the chair. Just as I set it down, the host who had been reviewing the script stood up, smiling brightly. "Mr. Rocky, you're here." I followed his gaze. Rocky entered, dressed sharply in a fitted suit, with thin-rimmed black glasses that gave him a refined air. "Hello." His voice, low and calm, paired with his polite smile, set several of the young interns around me whispering excitedly, "Oh my god, he's so handsome. That's the CEO of our group, and so young." I thought he'd be middle-aged with thinning hair. These were mostly interns who started around the same time as me, with little knowledge about business elites. Standing by the background panel, I clenched my fists, feeling as if my feet were welded to the floor, unable to move. Seeing him arrive, Alice began organizing everyone into place, and finally noticed me blending in with the background panel. From the side, she gestured for me to step away, mouthing, "Get down from there." Keeping my head down, face hidden in my mask, I forced myself to stay calm as I walked past him. The host was chatting with him, and he responded effortlessly, a polite smile on his face. As I passed, he lifted his arm to adjust his sleeve, his elbow brushing against me. I instinctively stepped aside, avoiding his offered hand, and he glanced at me, his tone unruffled as he murmured, "Apologies." I shook my head, hurriedly bowing before quickly moving away. The interview went smoothly. Near the end, he looked over at his assistant, who was holding a cat. With the room crowded and noisy, the cat seemed scared, meowing anxiously. Rocky gestured, and the assistant brought the cat to him. As soon as it was in his arms, the previously restless kitten instantly calmed down. The host, amused, commented, "Mr. Rocky, you have a cat? It's so well behaved. You must be a compassionate person. What's its name?" Rocky's gentle gaze on the cat softened his expression. Smiling, he said, "I just call it Kitty." The host continued, "What a sweet name." In my corner, the words made my heart skip a beat. "Kitty, he used to call me that. Kitty, I'll go play basketball. I'll bring you ice cream when I'm back. Kitty, I've learned a new magic trick. It's amazing, I'll show you. Kitty, I'm in trouble. I think I've fallen in love. Kitty, I got hurt. Comfort me, will you? Kitty, don't cry. I'm here with you." Memories flashed through my mind like old film scenes, each one reminding me of what an incredible person I had lost. "Hailey, Hailey." I snapped back as someone beside me shook me. Alice stood a few steps away, calling, "Hailey, I've called you several times. What were you thinking about? Move that machine to the front." "Okay." I nodded absent-mindedly. The machine was heavy and awkward, and I took small, slow steps to move it, finally setting it just below the stage. When I looked up, I met a shadowed gaze. Rocky sat there, his expression calm and indifferent, as if scanning the room in boredom. I quickly lowered my head, hoping he hadn't heard Alice call my name earlier. Unable to resist, I glanced up again, but he had already looked away. After the big interview, the high-profile guests left quickly, leaving us in turns to wrap up. It was past 8 p.m. By the time we finished tidying up, Alice smiled, inviting everyone out for dinner on her treat. I declined, saying I had something to take care of at home, and she didn't press. The group left, laughing, and I did one final check upstairs, making sure there were no mistakes, then turned off the lights and headed downstairs. The elevator opened on the ground floor, and there he was, Rockey. I quickly lowered my head, pretending not to see him. As I passed by, he grabbed my arm, saying, "Hello, you're with the staff here, right? We met earlier today." Panicked, I nodded. His tone was still polite. "I have a cat, and I think I left its collar in the interview room. Could you take me up to look for it?" For some reason, I felt as if he emphasized the words, "my cat." I didn't know if he recognized me. It didn't seem so. Maybe he had already forgotten me, but I couldn't forget. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm just an intern. I don't have the access card to take you up. You could check again tomorrow during the day." I felt his gaze on the top of my head for a moment, then he quietly responded. I waited, but he didn't move aside. When I looked up, I met his gaze again. He kept his composure. "And your name is?" I could feel my heart pounding faster and faster. In a whisper, I replied, "My name is Hailey." "Miss Hailey." He frowned slightly. "Have we met somewhere before?" He seemed to search his memory, and my heart sank. Though I wore a mask that covered most of my face, even when our eyes met, he didn't recognize me. It was clear he had truly forgotten. Perhaps noticing my discomfort, he gave a slight smile. 2 years ago, I had to take a train for a business trip. I got into an accident, and many things from before are a bit hazy. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. I just felt like I recognized you." "An accident?" Almost instinctively, I blurted, "What happened? Was it serious?" Maybe my concern was too apparent because his gaze lingered on me for a moment. I quickly composed myself, speaking casually. "I also took a train back to my hometown 2 years ago. You were seated beside me. Maybe that's when we met." I thought I had covered everything. Since he'd forgotten, perhaps it was for the best. At this, he suddenly smiled. "Miss Hailey, you have an excellent memory." Then, as I watched in surprise, his gaze grew cold and he turned to leave. 2 years ago, I finally mustered the courage to board the train back home after a long time. It was the anniversary of my grandmother's death. Since her passing, I had left school abruptly, moving from city to city. I had lost all contact with people I used to know. I hid myself daily behind a large mask, terrified that one day that man, like a vampire, would appear in front of me with a twisted expression, shouting, "Hailey, you little brat, hurry up and hand over all the money." Since birth, my life had been plagued with misfortune. My mother passed away during childbirth, and when my father saw I was a girl, he left without a second glance. If not for my grandmother, I don't know where I'd be now, or even if I'd still be alive. She was the one who personally brought me home from the hospital. She would say, "Our Hailey isn't a child that no one wants." So she, a lonely elderly woman, raised me, a child nobody wanted, for 19 years. I knew our family was not well off, and it was very hard for her to raise me alone, so I could only study desperately, earning scholarships again and again. When her health started to deteriorate, I was helpless and could only keep studying, hoping to get more scholarship money. In my first year of college, my grandmother fell at home, and her condition took a sudden turn for the worse. The doctor issued a final notice saying surgery had to be done within 2 months, as conservative treatments would no longer work. When I received the news, I grabbed my 300 yuan secondhand phone and ran out of the classroom to the train station, ignoring the curious glances from classmates. It was during the May Day holiday, and when the ticket seller told me there were no tickets available for the next 3 days, I couldn't hold back anymore, breaking down in tears outside the ticket hall. This is the sorrow of having no money. I couldn't even afford the cheapest train ticket. I don't know how long I sat there, tears drying up as I stared blankly ahead. That's when Rockey approached. He crouched down, getting on my level. He said, "Hailey, I'll take you home." That was the first time in my life I flew on a plane, and I realized that it only took an hour and a half to get to my hometown. After landing, we had to take a 2-hour bus ride to my small town. On the bus, I noticed Rockey looked uncomfortable, his brows furrowed. For someone like him, he'd probably never sat on such a bumpy and shabby bus in his life. In the hospital room, my grandmother lay there quietly. She looked relatively spirited and even smiled at Rockey, saying, "You're Hailey's classmate, right? Come, have a seat. Thank you for going through the trouble of accompanying her." We stayed with her for a while until she grew too tired and drifted off to sleep. Only then did I go to speak with her doctor. When I learned that the surgery would cost 300,000 yuan, my mind went blank. 300,000, a figure I felt I could never reach in this lifetime. But for Rockey, it was nothing. At my grandmother's insistence, I took him to eat a boxed meal from a nearby shop. He sat there without taking a single bite, and I felt both grateful and guilty, saying, "Thank you. I'll pay you back for the plane ticket someday. The food here isn't great. When we're back, I'll treat you to a nice meal." He still didn't touch the food and seemed to consider something for a long time before asking, "Hailey, if I pay for your grandmother's medical expenses, would you agree to be with me?" Rockey and I were in the same class, but we had very little interaction. At the start of the school year, he sat behind me and I overheard him talking to someone, saying, "I just glanced at the list. There's someone named Kitten. Funny name." I sat in front, silently. Later, once everyone got more acquainted, he specifically came over to explain, "Sorry, Hailey. That day, I thought your name was Kitten. You heard, right?" Among all the top students with prominent family backgrounds, Rockey stood out. People like him were on a different wavelength from me, and I instinctively kept my distance. So I simply shook my head and said, "No worries, I didn't hear." Compared to his many admirers, my attitude was almost indifferent. He looked at me, shrugged, and sat back down. Not long after, rumors started circulating that I was supposedly dating Rockey. It all began with a picture posted on the school confession wall. In the photo, Rockey's expression was calm, yet he was focused intently on a girl in front of him, though only the side of her face was visible. Because it involved Rockey, a campus star, the post quickly gained attention. Speculation about who the mystery girl was went on for days, until a classmate replied, "This seems to be our class's top student, Hailey." "Your class's top student? Is she famous?" "Not very, I guess. She's beautiful and smart, but extremely low-key. She gives off this quiet beauty vibe." I only found out about the rumors when I noticed people's curious stares the next day. It was my desk mate who told me, saying, "It's only been a day, and everyone's talking about it. Haven't you checked the school forum?" I tried to ignore the stares as I took out my books, replying, "My phone doesn't have that function. But Rockey must have one, right? He hasn't clarified anything. Are you two really dating?" I glanced back, and Rockey appeared indifferent to our conversation. His elbow propped on the desk, holding his chin, seemingly lost in thought. Noticing my gaze, he looked over, a puzzled expression as if to ask, "What's wrong?" He probably didn't know about that forum, so I turned back, pretending not to know. From then on, I minimized contact with him, not that there had been much to begin with. Until one day, a friend of his from another class came looking for him, stopping beside me and calling out, "Hey, Rockey, isn't this your rumored girlfriend? The one in your class? Sitting right behind you? Lucky guy, right?" Rockey, engrossed in his phone, looked up instinctively when he heard a girlfriend, gazing at me and asking, "My girlfriend?" After that, the rumors intensified, making it seem as if our relationship was real. Several times, I thought about clarifying things with him, but what could I say? He had never shown any affection for me, never confessed, and treated me no differently from anyone else. It was just gossip others spread, nothing more. I couldn't find the words. When Rockey suddenly proposed I be his girlfriend, I couldn't help but be stunned. He seemed prepared for my reaction, scratching his head awkwardly as he said, "I've liked you for quite a while, but I didn't know how to bring it up. It felt like no matter what I said or how much I liked you, you'd just turn me down. So I thought if I didn't say it, you wouldn't have a chance to refuse." It took me a moment to process what he was saying. "But you're saying it now. This is me taking advantage." He was straightforward, and when I stayed silent, likely fearing he'd hurt my pride, he added, "If you don't agree, I'd still help you." Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "You can consider it a loan." Agreed. It took me less than 2 minutes to decide. He knew to seize the moment, and so did I. Who I was with, or what I did with him, didn't matter to me at all, as long as he could save my grandmother. If I accepted, it would be an exchange. I'd repay him one day, and we'd be even. If I refused, he'd still lend me the $300,000, and I would forever owe him. Thinking about it now, when I left him hastily back then, the money I managed to repay him didn't even reach $20,000. In the end, I do owe him. After that interview, I took a day off. Apparently, he came by the next day, looking for a collar lost by his little kitten, but found nothing after searching around. Alice herself went to the reception room to apologize to him. He also inquired about our rest periods at the station, though for what reason, I don't know. Every day, I repeated the same tedious tasks as a production assistant, waiting for the day I could become a permanent employee. To be honest, I don't know if I'll get that chance. Of the 6 interns who joined, only 2 will be kept on. I took a leave from my studies in my junior year and didn't even obtain my graduation certificate, so the odds are slim. After work, like usual, I sat at a borrowed desk and skimmed through recent trending news articles. Without a computer at home, I had to borrow one from a senior colleague I was close with to study. Thankfully, I'd made a good impression at the station, and my dedication to learning was appreciated by my supervisor, who even had the security guard leave the door open for me. Not wanting to inconvenience anyone, I quickly went through a few articles, then turned off the computer and prepared to leave. But as I stood up, I heard faint crying from the office. Most girls, alone in a dark office building hearing such sounds, would probably be frightened. But I'm not. My grandmother had poor hearing due to her age. When it rained and thunder roared, I used to get scared and run to her. Even though she went to bed early, she would let me wake her, rocking her arm until she woke up. When I told her I was scared of the thunder, she sat by me, fanning me with a bamboo fan, assuring me, "Hailey, don't be afraid." Later, when I learned that she would stay up all night for fear I'd wake up afraid, I stopped being scared of thunder, no matter how loud. I guess it's because I was taught to be strong from a young age that I'm actually quite brave. When I opened the office door, I was surprised to find Alice there. She looked up and was clearly startled to see me. "Hailey?" I'd heard from colleagues that she'd been fighting a lot with her husband lately, and it seemed like she was hiding here to cry because of it. I'm not very good with words or comforting people, so I could only try to advise her, as my colleagues would. "Alice, no marriage is free from arguments. I heard your husband also used to work here, and you two are very much in love. Don't let pride drive you apart." She shook her head repeatedly as I spoke, clearly not listening. I guess my words weren't very convincing. "I really don't know how to say this," she sighed. "It's too difficult to admit." I knew she was ready to open up, so I pulled up a chair and sat beside her, prepared to encourage her however I could. But what she said next completely caught me off guard. "My husband, he wasn't like this before. Ever since he started gambling, it's as if he's become a different person." "Why? Gambling?" That word felt so distant to me now. It's been a long time since I last saw that man. "It's not that he changed. Gamblers aren't human." Alice looked at me, startled, while the comforting words I prepared completely escaped me. On the way home, I stood in the cold wind by the street for nearly an hour, trying to clear my mind. I forced myself to think about what I had to do tomorrow and my work schedule. Only then was I able to push down those suffocating memories. The apartment complex I rent in is quite old, plagued by years of disrepair and the smell of uncollected garbage. But this is the closest and cheapest place I could find near my job. Most people here are either unemployed or living off their parents, and vehicles are rarely seen coming in and out. So I immediately noticed the luxury car parked downstairs, looking completely out of place. Rockey was leaning against the car window, the glow of his cigarette flickering in the dark. His voice from that day still echoed in my ears, the mocking tone as he'd said, "Ms. Hailey, your memory is quite impressive." I knew he was doing it on purpose, that it wasn't amnesia, that he meant every word. He turned and saw me, then looked away, took another drag, and stubbed out his cigarette, releasing a thick smoke ring. "Worked late again?" His voice was hoarse. I noticed at least 4 or 5 cigarette butts scattered on the ground. I had no idea how long he'd been standing there. I pulled my thoughts together, putting on a polite smile. "Mr. Rockey, fancy meeting you here." But he didn't even bother to pretend, letting out a cold chuckle. "Take off the mask and talk to me. I wasn't always like this. By the time I was 7 or 8, I didn't even feel like a child anymore, and those classmates who buzzed around me only annoyed me. I didn't experience any of those teenage feelings others talk about, thinking of those so-called infatuations as a waste of time and energy. Everyone saw me as cold and indifferent. I didn't mind. I just focused on my studies, aiming to get scholarships and, after graduation, find a good job to give my grandmother a comfortable life. I never tried to please anyone or put on a facade. I thought living my own life was enough, but the reality is different. Every day since stepping into the adult world feels like a constant struggle. Over time, I learned to wear a mask. Rockey told me to take off that mask, but I can't afford that now. If I want to earn a living and survive, I need to master the art of the forced smile. Upstairs, Rockey's tone left no room for refusal. So, he stepped into my cluttered 30-square-meter apartment, probably smaller than his cat's bed. He made himself comfortable, finding a seat as if he owned the place. Holding a kettle, I asked, "Water or tea?" "Water." "All right. If I didn't call you out, would you keep pretending?" Rockey's question caught me off guard. "What?" He rubbed his forehead, sounding irritated. "The train." "Oh." If he hadn't mentioned it, I probably would have pretended to forget. After we broke up 3 years ago, I left in a rush, dropped out, and moved to a city I knew nothing about, afraid he'd come after me. After a year of wandering, I finally worked up the courage to return on my grandmother's death anniversary. I never expected to run into Rockey on that train. As usual, I wore a large mask, pulled my cap low, and shrank by the window, feigning sleep. At some point, someone sat next to me. I was about to ask them to move so I could go to the restroom. But when I saw that familiar face, I clamped my mouth shut and sat back down. To avoid being seen, I held it in the whole trip, not daring to go to the bathroom. I poured his water, asking casually, "What were you doing on that train?" Given Rocky's style, he'd never take a cramped, smoky green train. "What do you think?" I clicked my tongue, no idea. He seemed exasperated. I was collecting a debt. I glanced at him. Could it have been my debt he was after? After that, Rocky went silent, and I had nothing to say. We sat in silence for half an hour. As the kettle emptied, Rocky still showed no signs of leaving, so I got up to boil another pot. Then he asked, "Did you take the day off that day to avoid me?" He didn't specify the day, but I knew. The day after his interview, he said he'd come by to look for his cat's collar, so I took the day off. I nodded, honestly. Pretty much. Why? I didn't see the need for any more goodbyes. Silence settled again. Finally, Rocky stood up, his back to me, his tone carrying an inexplicable sadness. "Hailey, when we broke up, you said you never liked me. Was that true?" But Rocky didn't wait for an answer. As if afraid of what I might say, he hurried out. He didn't appear again for a month after that. Alice took some time off recently, and when she returned, she seemed even worse. She was no longer the strong, fearless woman she used to be, as if she had aged overnight. Finally, one day, when she came to work wrapped in a scarf, I knocked on her office door. After a long moment, I heard, "Come in." I looked at her, the scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, oddly out of place in the heat of July. "Hailey, is there something you need?" She meticulously sorted the papers on her desk. "Alice." For the first time, I didn't call her Big Sister Alice, but just her name. "This isn't the end. Today doesn't have to be your future." Her voice wavered. "Hailey, what are you talking about?" I think Alice is a smart woman who knows when to cut her losses. For years, I'd kept a low profile, never one to stand out. But I knew Alice was a good person and didn't deserve to be dragged down like this. Maybe I was impulsive because I understood all too well what a rotten gambler is like. The wounds she bore today were just the beginning. If she still held out hope for his redemption, she was being naive. After that, she took an extended leave. Eventually, she resigned. I heard the news while printing a document. The list of full-time positions was posted. 2 girls from prestigious schools with impressive abilities had been selected. Staring at the papers emerging from the printer, I shook my head in resignation. This was fate, I supposed. Although I wasn't chosen for a permanent role, the supervisor kept me on. He said I may not have impressive credentials, but I had ability and worked hard. My salary increased, but my life remained simple. One day at work, while waiting for the elevator, a commotion erupted behind me in the lobby. "Where's Alice? Tell her to come out." "Hiding from me, huh? Think I won't find you? Worthless. I'm doing you a favor asking for money." He looked like a thug, breaking free of the security guards several times, yelling and cursing. An older colleague beside me sighed. When did little Sue turn out like this? Soon, someone must have called her, and Alice finally appeared. My colleagues had already hurriedly taken the elevator up, avoiding the scene like the plague. But I stayed, watching the mess unfold. Alice tried to calm him down, speaking gently, but he wouldn't leave, making a scene and shouting insults. At last, he snapped and shoved Alice to the ground. "Damn it, stop bothering me." Turning around, he saw me standing by the elevator. My gaze must have irritated him, and he sneered, "What are you looking at?" In that instant, he became someone else in my mind. The next second, I pulled a fruit knife from my bag. He had his back to me, but Alice, lying hurt on the ground, saw me clearly. She shook her head frantically. "Hailey, no, don't do something foolish." Something foolish? I was eradicating a menace to society. In that moment, I lost all reason. With only one voice in my head, this man deserved to die. As I raised the knife, he sensed it, turned around, and his eyes widened in horror. The next second, his body flew away from me. My wrist was gripped tightly. "Hailey, put the knife down." Who was speaking? Why did the voice sound so distant? "Little cat, little cat, little cat." I blinked hard, my mind slowly clearing. Rocky was still holding my wrist. Seeing that I was coming to, he gently coaxed the knife out of my hand. "It's okay, now, it's okay, little cat." Maybe he was overwhelmed too. I couldn't quite make out what he said after that. Something like, "He's not that man." Half asleep, I felt like I was having a long dream. The scenes in the dream were all too familiar. I had just gotten off a pirate ship ride, feeling dizzy and nauseous. And Rocky helped me sit on a nearby bench to rest and went to get me a hot drink. He hadn't been gone long when a guy walked over. "Hey, beautiful, can I get your WeChat?" Still dizzy from the ride, I looked up, and instantly felt my stomach churn, reflexively dry heaving a couple of times. The guy seemed deeply offended, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "What's your problem?" Before I could respond, a familiar voice spoke up beside me. "What are you pointing at her for?" Rocky had returned without me noticing, holding a milk tea in one hand and a juice in the other. He was taller than the guy, and his expression was cold. The guy seemed intimidated but tried to keep his pride. "What's it to you?" Rockey handed me the warm drink, advising, "Have a sip to settle yourself." Then he turned and gave the guy a sharp look. "Anything involving her involves me. If you've got a problem, take it up with me." The guy opened his mouth, but after a long pause, he turned and left. I remember that happened when he took me to the amusement park in our sophomore year. The scene blurred and changed. I was feverish and had overslept in the dorm. My roommate hurriedly tried to wake me up for class, but when I opened the door, I saw Rockey standing there. He reached over to feel my forehead and then, reassured, said, "Finally awake. If you hadn't woken up, I was about to call 119. If I was sick, shouldn't he call 120? He laughed. "I was planning on getting a crane to haul you out of here if I had to." Later, my roommate told me Rockey came by after I missed my first class. She couldn't argue him out of it, so she brought him to the dorm and even repeated what he'd told the dorm auntie. "Auntie, my sister's feverish and missed her class, and our mom's so worried. She insisted I come check on her and maybe take her to the hospital." The image of him lying with a serious face made me laugh, but as I laughed, my smile froze. A face, angry and twisted, slowly sharpened in my vision. "Didn't you get quite a lot in condolence money at the funeral? Hand it over." "Useless. If you don't have money, go out and make some. You know how, right? I heard you have a rich boyfriend. Go ask him for 200,000 for me." "You're not going? Then I'll go myself." My father, who'd vanished for more than 20 years, suddenly showed up at my grandmother's funeral. At first, I was confused, thinking he was there to pay his respects. But before the service ended, he was pressing me to hand over the condolence money. It turned out he'd come just for the money. He refused to leave until he got it, so I gave it to him to avoid a scene at my grandmother's funeral. I thought he'd disappear again. But just days later, he was back, smirking. "I heard you have a rich boyfriend?" I couldn't hold back my disgust and vomited. He didn't care, whistling with a smug grin. "Having a daughter is great. She's already landed a rich guy. Go, ask him for 200,000 for me." I refused, and he said he'd go himself. At first, I didn't take him seriously, didn't think his words had any weight. But the next day, as Rockey and I left campus for lunch, I spotted that man near the school gate. He looked disheveled, stopping passers-by, as if asking them for information. "They say you can't choose your parents, but you can choose the life you want." I knew clearly that I had fallen for Rockey through over 1,000 days and nights these past 3 years. I had even daydreamed about a future together, wondering if we'd stay here or move to another city. I thought, no matter where, my future would include him. But then, I felt powerless. Life, it turns out, isn't something I get to choose. In those 5 days, I took a leave of absence, broke up with him, packed, and left for a distant place. Afraid that man would come back to find me, I kept my head down, hiding from sight ever since. Maybe sensing my unease, someone gripped my hand tightly, patting my shoulder gently. "Don't be afraid, little cat." The voice I'd missed through countless nights had a kind of magic. I held his hand in return, and somehow, I really did feel a bit more at peace. Slowly opening my eyes, I saw Rockey right there. I murmured, "Rockey, I dreamed of you again." He paused from opening a thermos container, glanced over deeply, perhaps realizing I wasn't fully awake, and continued his task. In a haze, he fed me a bowl of porridge. Feeling half-conscious, I sipped as he coaxed gently, "One more sip, you'll feel better soon." After each sip, he would say, "Just one last sip, little cat, then you'll be all set." The next time I woke, the phone was ringing, jolting me awake. It was dark outside, and Rockey stood by the window, his silhouette somehow melancholy. I hesitated, calling out, "Rockey?" He turned, "You're awake?" I nodded slowly and glanced toward the bedside table. "Your phone's ringing." Seeming to snap out of his thoughts, he picked up the call. He spoke briefly, distracted, then hung up and stayed by the window, still with his back to me. "Hailey." He called my name softly, then paused for a long time before continuing, saying, "This is hard for me, but I want to know your answer now. There are things that need to be said. I'm not going to be just friends with you." He turned, his gaze serious. "I could love you a lifetime, but I can't wait a lifetime." He told me about his life over the past 3 years. Now 25, rejecting multiple arranged dates from his family. The call just now was another setup. "Was there another reason you broke up with me?" I didn't want to lie to him, but the shameful truth stuck in my throat. After a moment, he gently tested a name, Bame. My shock was unmistakable. How do you know him?" "Bame, the name of my wretched father." From Rockey, I learned that Bame had already been imprisoned a year ago. Back then, I had broken up with him hastily, barely giving him time to react. Then, I took a leave of absence, and it was as if I had vanished from the world. He searched for me desperately but could find no trace. At that time, he wondered if the only person I truly cared about was my grandmother. That perhaps I was only with him to cover her medical expenses. Once my grandmother was gone, I no longer needed him, and discarded him like something I couldn't hold on to any longer. Maybe, he thought, I never really cared for him. After 2 months of despondency, he returned to school, where he heard my name again. Isn't that crazy old guy at the gate sick or something? He keeps stopping people, asking if they know Hailey, saying he's her dad. Yeah. He stopped me twice, too. He's completely insane. That guy's definitely not in his right mind. No idea what's up with him. After hearing these rumors, Rockey began waiting at the school gate every day. That man, whom everyone avoided like the plague, was the one Rockey was eager to see, because he'd heard that man was my father. Yet, after half a month, he never once saw the man. The guy must have left, unable to find me. Rockey spent half a year locked inside his home, only coming out after his brother dragged him out. You've been to her hometown, right? She'll probably go back for her grandmother's memorial, his brother said. Suddenly, it was as if Rockey came back to life. He camped out in the provincial capital near my hometown, waiting 3 or 4 days. He took the same bus every day, unsure which day I'd return. Finally, on my grandmother's memorial day, he saw me. To be honest, for the past year, I covered myself up whenever I went out, leaving almost nothing exposed except my eyes. But as he walked through each car of the train, he recognized me instantly, huddled by the window. He wanted to rush over, grab my arm, and ask me why I had left without a word. But he remembered his brother's advice: people don't disappear for no reason. What if she has a secret she can't share? So, he held back, sitting quietly beside me, staring without blinking, as if afraid that if he closed his eyes, I'd vanish again. After about an hour, I finally moved, and he quickly looked away. But just as I was about to get up and say something, I changed my mind and sat back down, pretending not to notice him. He knew I'd seen him. Before the train reached the station, he purposely moved to another seat, then followed me off the train. He trailed me to my grandmother's grave, then watched me return home. Everything seemed calm, but just as he turned to leave, he noticed a man sneaking around the wall by my house. When the man reached for the door, Rockey kicked him to the ground, and a neighbor's dog started barking wildly. Worried about startling me, Rockey dragged the man to a nearby factory building. Thinking the man meant me harm, he beat him fiercely. The man dodged, yelling, "Who the hell are you? Hit me, and I'll slice you up later, just you wait." Rockey sneered, "All talk, huh?" and landed a punch squarely on his mouth. "Listen up. I'm her boyfriend. If I catch you following her again, I'll make sure you'll never get up again." The beaten man suddenly chuckled. "Boyfriend? Do you know who I am? I'm her dad." Rockey paused, and the man staggered up, circling him. "So, you're the rich guy she hooked up with?" Rockey had never heard of a father speaking of his daughter like this, and he frowned in disgust. "You, calling yourself a father?" But since the man claimed to be my father, Rockey stopped hitting him, and instead asked coldly, "What do you want with her?" "What do I want?" The man scoffed, spitting on the ground. "Just looking to get a little money off her. That little brat's got some nerve, hiding from me all this time." From his words, Rockey began to sense that I must have had a reason for disappearing so suddenly. Could it be because of this man? As Rockey pondered, the man added, "I heard you've got money, kid. Fork over 200,000. Rockey laughed like he'd heard the most absurd joke. "Say that again?" With Rockey towering over him, his expression cold, the man lost some nerve but still persisted. "Fine, don't give it to me. I'll go get it from my daughter myself." He sneered. "What's wrong with you, rich boy? I told her to get 200,000 from you back then, and she wouldn't do it. You're not just a show-off, are you? You told her to ask me for money?" Rockey had never known this, as I had never told him. What's wrong with a little cash? Hooking up with a rich guy and forgetting her own father? As long as I'm alive, she'll never escape me. The man sounded smug, not noticing the deepening look in Rockey's eyes. That day, Rockey seemed tireless, beating the man mercilessly without hitting any vital spots. When the man passed out, he poured water over him to wake him, then continued. At dawn, Rockey left the factory and went to my old home. He hesitated outside the door for half an hour before gently ringing the bell, but I was already gone. He'd planned to take me with him, to keep that man from ever approaching me again. He didn't even care anymore if I loved him or not, or why I had to break up with him, but I had disappeared once more. And this time, I was gone for 2 years. He didn't know that the moment he and Bame made a commotion outside the gate, I had already fled. I sensed that it must be Bame looking for me, but I didn't know Rockey was there, too. After that, despite my grandmother's memorial, I didn't dare to go back. So, he completely lost track of me. From time to time, he would check the old house, hoping that one day he'd find I'd returned. but I didn't, though he did run into Bame again. He suddenly felt like laughing. Despite his every effort, he couldn't find the person he was looking for. Yet the person he despised kept appearing uninvited. Bame was afraid of him. He had just wanted to check if there was anything in the old house to sell. But when he saw Rockey there, he turned to run. Rockey grabbed his collar, smiling harmlessly. "Want money?" Almost instinctively, Bame nodded eagerly. The first time, Rockey gave him 100,000, which he lost in 2 months. The second time, Rockey gave him 200,000, which he lost in a month. The third time, Rockey gave him 500,000, and he lost it in less than half a month. When Bame showed up again, security threw him out like garbage. An unrepentant gambler, Bame had been indulging recklessly with Rockey's money, betting larger and larger sums, until it was all gone, and then he found that the money source had dried up. Those days of high-stakes gambling had left him insatiable. Small bets no longer satisfied him. What to do? He came up with a plan: high-interest loans. Then, a few months later, Bame's debt from these loans had piled up to several million. He could borrow, but he couldn't repay, so he ran. Rockey had his secretary give Bame's address to the loan sharks. It didn't take long for them to find him. Loan sharks are ruthless, and upon hearing Bame couldn't repay, they broke his arm. Rockey watched from a distance as they broke his arm right there, and as Bame screamed in pain, he called the police. Both sides were arrested for gang fighting, for loan sharking, for addiction to gambling, for abominable behavior. Bame was sentenced to 8 years. Last November, he was formally imprisoned. Rockey went to see him and, smiling, told him, "The best is yet to come, just wait and enjoy." He walked away, then suddenly turned back. "Oh, by the way, it looks like you won't get Hailey to support you in your old age." As he left the prison, he felt a weight lifted. He wanted to share the good news with me, but he couldn't find me, and could only murmur helplessly, "Kitten, are you doing well?" "I'm not." That day, Rockey told me many things. All those years when I was hiding and missing him, he was still doing everything he could to come toward me. After a long silence, he said, "Hailey, I hope you can move on from the past. If you're willing, we could have a wonderful future. I'll give you some time, think it over, and tell me your answer." He had cleared away all the obstacles and taken 99 steps toward me. Could I not summon the courage to take just one step toward him? When we were together before, Rockey teased me. He'd say he hadn't given me a grand confession yet, that at least there should be balloons and flowers covering the grass. I laughed and said he was cheesy. What did he say then? He said, "Hailey, if you gave me that kind of confession, I'd be moved to tears." Now, I plan to do just that. Alice suddenly came to see me, saying she'd divorced. She told me she'd spent the time off from work handling the divorce, deciding to let go of that relationship. She said, spoiled milk might still be the same milk, but it's no longer drinkable. This time she was here because she'd started a small company and wanted to know if I'd help her out. After thinking it over, I submitted my resignation to my old job, but I made a small request. I hadn't had many friends all these years, and now Alice counted as one. So I told her about my plan to confess to Rockey. I want to give him a grand confession, to tell him that all these years it wasn't just one-sided. This time, I'm going to gather the courage to let everyone know I like him. Alice said the company is small, just over 10 people with me included, but everyone would be my cheerleaders. After much thought, I sent Rockey a message. "Rockey, I won't hide anymore. From today on, I'll work harder to become a better version of myself, someone worthy of you. Wait for me." Alice arranged for a dorm, so I moved out of that old, shabby place. With limited startup funds, everyone faced a lot of pressure in the beginning. Alice put her entire savings into starting the company. But starting a business isn't easy. In the early days, they kept pitching stories, trying to make a mark. But the response was lukewarm. Since joining, I've been incredibly busy every day. Before long, Alice suddenly brought good news. A big shot investor saw promise in our company and decided to invest. We hugged each other, almost crying with joy. The next day, the investor came. Alice eagerly welcomed him. "Boss Rockey, you're here." I stood in the welcoming line, unable to look away from him. "Rockey." Since I sent that message, it had been a while since we'd met. To think Alice's investor was him, why would he be interested in such a small company? Perhaps my gaze lingered too long because Rockey noticed and looked over. I opened my mouth, wanting desperately to speak to him, but held back at the last moment. Alice continued with the formalities, and our colleagues lined up respectfully, holding tight to this connection. However, Rockey seemed to have just come for a look and didn't stay long. After a quick tour, Alice walked him to the door, promising, "Don't worry, Boss Rockey. Though our company is small, we're young and full of energy, and we won't let you down in the future." Rockey nodded, letting his gaze fall on me for a moment, with a hint of a smile. All right, I'll be waiting. Blushing, I lowered my head. The R Corporation has countless subsidiaries in various fields. It's said that the company is led by both Rockey and his brother, Peter, each responsible for different areas. As his secretary put it, Boss Rockey is always busy. Yet despite his busy schedule, Boss Rockey stopped by our little company every few days. I later realized he wasn't just interested in our small company, he was fully invested. At first, each time he visited, everyone was on edge, afraid the big boss might withdraw his funding. But instead of withdrawing, this foolishly generous boss treated us almost like his own kids. He'd treat us to big meals, organize team-building events, and on late nights, order the best takeout for everyone. In less than 2 months, all 10 or so people in the company had fallen under his charm. In just 2 months, the company gradually found its footing. Alice had been working in news for years and had connections. Initially, we lacked funding, but with Rockey's support, we lacked nothing. The news article I wrote 2 days ago made the headlines, getting a mention from the national media. And after that, I made a decision. In the office, it was just the two of us, and Alice's voice sounded particularly loud. You're going to confess? Yes. I nodded. She wasn't even surprised. I have to say, Hailey, what era is this? You're seriously going to all this trouble to make a formal, old-school confession? Waiting until your article made headlines? You've got fame, confidence, only now you dare to confess? Then, with a puzzled look, she continued. I just don't get it. He must be quite the big shot, quite amazing, for you to feel so serious about him. I didn't tell her that. Compared to Rockey, my feelings were so small, barely a fraction of his. I had prepared everything, even renting out a fancy venue at a high-end club, which I chose carefully because the carpet looked like a lawn and I loved it right away. The flowers and balloons were ready, stashed in Alice's trunk. Even the roles for arranging flowers and blowing up balloons had been delegated. A dozen colleagues stood behind me, eager and ready. With nervous excitement, I dialed Rockey's number. Alice and the others knew I was about to make a big confession, but not who the recipient was. I could already imagine their surprise when they saw Rockey. They'd probably think I was incredibly bold to confess to the boss behind the scenes. The smile was hard to contain. The phone rang twice before telling me the user was busy. Puzzled, I checked the screen and, undeterred, dialed again. Again, I got the same busy signal. What was going on? My colleagues noticed something was off, exchanging glances. Jack couldn't help but ask, "What's happening? Is this not going to work?" Alice shot him a warning look, then swatted him with her bag. "Don't jinx it," she said, adding softly to those around her, "Can't you see Hailey's all nervous?" This was a big decision for her. Don't mess with her confidence, everyone, behave. I stood there dazed, clutching my phone, and made a decision. Everyone can go home. Thank you all for today. It looks like my plan is falling through. Alice, sensing my disappointment, took a few steps forward. Hailey, don't give up. It's just a busy signal. Just wait and call again later. We're here with you. I looked up and smiled at her. It's okay, you all go ahead. If all goes well, I'll treat everyone tomorrow. What do you mean? She asked, confused. I'm going to find him. It was just a busy signal, nothing serious. If you really want to see someone, calling isn't the only way, right? It was Saturday, and I knew where Rockey's villa was. Worst case, I'd just go there myself, but bringing everyone wasn't ideal. If a dozen people showed up at his doorstep, they might think it was a heist. Alice clapped me on the shoulder with a hint of pride in her voice. That's my girl, Hailey. I'm rooting for you. Yeah. I nodded firmly, feeling confident. Rockey, here I come. Sorry, I didn't make it. Here's why. Just as I was about to leave, after a heartfelt hug with Alice, someone called my name, Hailey. I turned to see Rockey stepping out of his parked car and walking toward me. You. I started, but he interrupted. Why couldn't I reach you on the phone? Same with yours, I replied. He raised an eyebrow, realizing what happened. You were trying to call me too? I nodded. He gently brushed his hand over my head, and I looked down, shy. We had a silent understanding. The atmosphere was perfect until Alice barged in, completely oblivious. She walked over from behind me. Rockey, what brings you to the office this late? She looked from me to him, her eyes full of curiosity, and put an arm around my shoulders. We were just about to head out. Hailey has an important date tonight. Embarrassed, I gave her a look, but she just winked at me, as if to say, don't worry, I got your back. It seemed she misunderstood. Rockey picked up on her meaning quickly. He probably never imagined he'd one day be mistaken for someone harassing his employee. He gave a barely noticeable smile and asked, a date? Before I could answer, Alice blurted out, yep, and the whole company is going along to cheer her on. Rockey, care to join? I heard him laugh slightly and say, sure. Alice's words were meant to invite him, but really implied, "We're busy, so if you don't mind, maybe it's time to head out?" But she hadn't counted on Rockey wanting to join in on the fun. In the car, Alice whispered, "Hailey, honestly, I always knew you had someone special, so I never asked." "What?" I looked at her, puzzled. She hesitated before saying, "It's just, I think Rockey might actually be interested in you. Didn't you see how close he was earlier? I noticed it even before when he used to sneak looks at you in the office." Noticing my awkward laugh, she asked again, "I'm serious, and you're sure this other person won't get jealous if Rockey sticks around?" Unable to hold back a smile, I said, "Alice, thank you for looking out for me. Hey, I'm just saying, after all the effort you've put in, don't you worry something might go wrong?" "Nothing will go wrong." Looking out the window, I added, "That person is Rockey." This confession didn't quite go as I had planned. Originally, Alice had been saying loudly that she'd cheer me on like 10 people, fully backing me up. She even boldly declared that if the person dared to say no, she'd weld the door shut and not let them leave. But now, she's quietly sitting in the corner with an air pump, and I've heard the balloon popping 6 or 7 times already. Several colleagues, seeing her state, stopped trying to break the silence with small talk. The atmosphere grew quiet. Strangely enough, the guy I was confessing to was at that moment happily arranging flowers on the wall. Wasn't this supposed to be a mysterious, touching confession? How did it end up like this? "Hailey, how about these flowers?" Rockey picked up a bunch of flowers from the table, looking at me with interest. I said, "Whatever you like is fine. I had this all planned out so well. I booked the venue a day in advance, went out at noon to buy balloons and flowers, and called Alice and a group of colleagues to the club after work. Then, I'd call Rockey, casually inviting him to dinner, so by the time he arrived, we'd have everything set up. He'd open the door to a big surprise. Wouldn't that be touching?" Once everything was arranged, it was already 9 p.m. Jack nervously asked me, "What's with Alice? Did her tire explode and throw her off?" I glanced at Alice just as she looked up and shot me a sharp glare. Fine, it was my fault for keeping the confession target a secret, but I just wanted to give him a simple, heartfelt confession. If everyone knew the confession was for the big boss, would they even dare to come and watch? When I didn't respond, Jack pointed to Rockey. "Why is the boss so lively? Does he think of us as family or something? By the way, Hailey, when is your confession target arriving? It's been ages already." Me. After he finished placing the last flower, Rockey walked over to me. The smile in his eyes was almost overflowing. "Hailey, I'm all set." He even bent a bit, as if to show off his handiwork. "Rockey, aren't you smiling a bit too much?" Alice let out a dissatisfied huff from behind me. I turned and saw her quietly giving me a thumbs up, mouthing the words, "Good luck." I had rehearsed my confession so many times, but now that the moment had come, I couldn't help but feel nervous. My words came out awkwardly. "Rockey, I do." Before I could finish, Rockey eagerly grabbed my hand, as if afraid I'd change my mind any second. I looked up, seeing stars in his eyes. "Rockey, aren't you a bit too hasty?" I swallowed, staring right at his throat. The other colleagues, utterly confused. Alice, can't bear to watch, feels like her eyes are burning. All that time spent preparing my confession speech ended up wasted, because Rockey took out a small box from his pocket as he stood before me. Me? What's he up to? Rockey hadn't stopped smiling all night. Handing me the box with what sounded like a command, though his voice lacked confidence, he said, "Hailey, a confession should be sincere. So you had a ring ready? At this point, this has turned into your show." I forced myself to think of sad things to stifle the urge to laugh, then put on a serious face. Opening the box, I saw a pair of rings. I glanced down. The initials of our names were boldly engraved on the rings. Then I knelt down on one knee, looked up, unable to hide the love in my eyes, and said, "Rockey, would you like to make a life together?" I guessed this was what he wanted. But for some reason, he just looked down at me, his eyes almost unblinking until they grew misty from dryness. Then slowly reached out his hand. "Hailey, I've waited far too long for this day. Rockey, from this day forward, I won't keep you waiting anymore. I'll stand by your side." Several colleagues were still in shock, the silence hanging for a few seconds. Then Alice let out a playful whistle, snapping everyone out of it, and they clapped and cheered. "Hailey's confession target is the boss? My CPU's fried. Give me a sec to reboot. What is this? An office romance?" They started chattering all at once. Alice spoke up, calm and collected. "Office romance, my foot. These two knew each other ages ago. Hailey made it a condition before joining." Then, she gave Rockey a suspicious look. "Rockey, did you invest in the company for selfish reasons?" Rockey held my hand, giving an exaggerated cough to change the subject. "Shouldn't you all be calling her a boss lady?" Then came a chorus of sarcastic "a boss lady" from everyone. Rockey seemed to enjoy the title immensely. happily promising a generous bonus for everyone calling me that. I suddenly remembered, back when I first found out Rocky was an investor, I'd secretly asked him why he did it. Back then, his voice had been full of confidence. Hailey, I invested in this little company not because of you, but because of its bright future. Don't overthink it. Alright, I get it. I'll be sure to overthink it a lot. The end. If you like Puppy's story, please follow and like it. Updated every morning at 9 a.m.